So it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon, who is Jessica Keating, who is a professor at Carleton College, professor of early modern art and architecture. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Fulbright Commission to Germany, the Deutscher Akademische Austauschdienst, the Samuel Kress Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. Her book, Animating Empire, Automata, the Holy Roman Empire in the Early Modern World, was published by Penn State Press in 2018 and was awarded the Andrew W. Mellon Art History Publication Initiative Prize. She's currently working on her next book, which addresses abundance, androgyny, eros, and myth in the collection of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. Jessica will be speaking to us this afternoon on Fruits of the Flesh, Abundance and Prudence in the collection of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark, Vera, and Andrew, for inviting me and allowing me to participate in this great conference. And thank you, Laura, for all of your help in organizing everything. So, when I was informed about the topic of this conference, Techne and Prudence in the early modern Kunstkammer, I thought I might take a retrospective glance at courtly early modern automata which were housed in German princely Kunstkammern, and which, so I argued in my recent book, made precise political and religious arguments. However, after mulling it over, I instead decided to take a forward look and present some of the materials from my new book project on the collection of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, which has just gotten underway. And so that is to say, this is all very new material, and I'm really looking forward to all of your comments and suggestions and questions. So lay it on me. All right. So to begin, I want to take this afternoon to make two principal connected claims. One of them is that out of the complexity of Rudolf II's imperial Kunstkammer was an elemental simplicity, namely plenitude or abundance. The second is that pictures that were made at Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II's court that figured abundance were crucial to imperial politics, broadly construed. Let's start with the abundant nature of the Kunstkammer. And I just show you this for eye candy, because I'm an art historian and we always have to have pictures up. So let's start with the abundant nature of the Kunstkammer. The 16th century was a period of prolific activity in both the theory and the practice of collecting. Stimulated by a booming economy, a thriving art market, and expanded global trade, the urge to collect accelerated as the century proceeded. The desire manifested itself in the establishment of princely, academic, ecclesiastical, and mercantile collections, and it translated itself into a rush of treatises, inventories, accounts, and letters that took collecting as their central concern. At the same time, preoccupations with what and how much to collect, as well as how to order and display the contents of collections, erupted, not just in the discourse on collecting, but also within the collections themselves. This double characteristic of 16th century collecting, proliferation and self-consciousness, is prominent in the Kunstkammer of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. In fact, plenitude became a theme of the imperial collection, both explicitly and implicitly, whether in the copious amounts of objects collected or in their meaning. Oops, there should be a blank. Oh, no, there's not. I will leave it there. For today's lecture, I want to focus on figurations of abundance that were prevalent at Rudolph's court. By figurations of abundance, I mean images that figured plenitude allegorically, as well as images that took as their subjects seasonal productivity, sexual fertility, androgyny, and nourishment. Indeed, grounded in one of the most intense of human desires, to be abundant, fecund, and most of all, generative, This intensity has made Rudolph's collection a seemingly inexhaustible subject and such a pivotal topic in the history of collecting. And today I'm attempting to contribute to this scholarly proliferation by suggesting that Rudolph's cornucopian collection can be interpreted as a peak expression of princely prudence. To be sure, one might think it's wrong-headed to connect wise governance to erotic paintings of satyrs cavorting with nymphs, or prints of an emasculated Hercules, or drawings of lactating virgins. But I hope to begin to convince you that this line of inquiry is not totally misguided. It must be emphasized the treatment of this topic here today is highly selective, and what I want to do is offer some preliminary observations and reflections on several paintings, engravings, and drawings that were produced, collected, and displayed at Rudolph's court. And I have the very modest hope that these observations and reflections might open up new directions for thinking about Rudolph's collection. Or to put it slightly differently, I hope to expound on some small evidentiary instances I have found in images to make some tentative suggestion about what excessive imagery of excess can teach us about good judgment. Now, it should come as no surprise to this audience that figurations of abundance actually manifest themselves in wildly divergent ways. Accordingly, I have organized them into groups. So I will start off my examination with an analysis of an allegory of abundance. I'll show you here. I will then discuss images of seasonal productivity, then sexual fertility, and then pictures that center on figures of nourishment, before concluding with some more synthetic remarks on what these images have to do with prudence in the early modern princely Kunstkammer. Before I dive into the pictures, a few words on the nature of Rudolph's collection may be useful here. The collection was established in 1583 when Rudolf quit Vienna and moved the imperial court to Prague. It was in the city on the Vltava that Rudolf renovated the medieval Radchany palace to house his family, his entourage, and his collection. Built over the imperial stable, the collection contained roughly around 10,000 objects, and some think including close to 3,000 paintings. The first inventory of the collection compiled between 1607 and the first inventory of the collection was compiled between 1607 and 1611 by the German antiquarian and painter Daniel Froschel. We gain a good impression at a textual remove of the makeup of the collection from the 1607 to 1611 inventory. Cups made from rhinoceros horns that warded off poison and sickness, unicorn horns which had magical healing properties, vessels crafted from tortoise shells and mounted in gold, cases and game boards inlaid with mother of pearl from Gujarat, Indo-Portuguese aspersoriums, woven blankets, wax paintings, dried plants and seeds, Turkish shoes, feather paintings, automata, paintings of the loves of the gods, Florentine Pietrodora tables and plaques, hunting trophies, tableaus made from coral, tableaus made from unworked minerals, seashells, portraits of European nobles and clergy, the bones of giants, an organ from Siam, suits of armor, loads of Chinese porcelain, antique coins, painted altarpieces, silver fountains, small and large bronzes, astrolabes, pagan idols, quadrants, sextants, clocks, ivory fans, and reliquaries. I could go on. This is just a random sampling of the objects that are economically described by Froschel in the inventory. And based on the inventory alone, it's clear that the Imperial Kunstkammer was a place intended to house a vast amount of endlessly varied objects that at first glance appeared to collapse the boundaries between the high and the low, art and nature, the monstrous and the beautiful, the indigenous and the exotic, true and false, and precious and mundane. Thus, the Kunstkammer was not a tensile system built up through a series of antitheses. As such, it was both a conceptual and a spatial expression of an exuberant copia, and perhaps the most obvious articulation of plenitude in the imperial collections. Indeed, I could write a second talk on the Imperial Kunstkammer, material proliferation, and prudence. However, a fuller understanding of abundance and its connection to wise governance in the Kunstkammer requires, at least I think requires, that one investigate the far more varied ways bounty is manifested in the images produced for Rudolph. Okay, so one such manifestation was allegory. Consider, and here we go, finally to this image, consider Hans von Achen's Peace, Art, and Abundance. The painting of 1602 places us before 3 female figures in various states of undress. Draped in red, the personification of art fondles the bare shoulder of peace. Disarmed, peace sports only a jeweled brooch nestled between her bare breasts. Her armor has been conspicuously piled up in the lower left corner of the picture, along with her weapons, arrows, and a spear. To the right of these martial trappings kneels the personification of abundance, whose strapping back faces us as she looks up at the nude figure of Amity. Abundance cradles her cornucopia in her right arm, while her left holds aloft a precious vessel filled with wine in a gesture of offering to her companion. Whereas Abundance's gaze is trained on peace, Art looks up to the heavens, a gold model of which she grasps in her right hand, an orrery. Peering out at us, peace appears distracted or uninterested in this inner pictorial attention. Indeed, the olive branches silhouetted against the red curtain, which have been theatrically pulled apart to reveal the scene, appears to be for our benefit and not those of her companion. So what we have here embodied in these personifications is the meeting of opposing forces. Art, as she is portrayed, stands in for things high, namely the celestial and the intellectual realm, and Abundance, in her humble position, has come onto the scene to call to the mind the terrestrial and the bestial realms, a suggestion that is made evident not only by the wine she presents and her bull's horn, filled with nature's bounty, but also her proximity to the feathers of Peace's spear and the skin of Peace's drum. Peace, as van Aachen wants us to realize, has occasioned the meeting of these forces. Based on Abundance's offerings and Art's gentle caress, we might conclude that these personifications have come here in servitude to nurture Peace's flourishing. Abundance provides nature's plenitude, which the horn she holds can't contain, and Art provides knowledge, which her emphatically geometrical and ordered armillary sphere signals. Peace herself embodies both of these realms. Her idealized body, which cuts diagonally through the heart of the painting, has been rendered according to classical proportions, a method of depiction that depended upon geometrical and mathematical schemes imposed on the human form. But within this figure composed according to aesthetic doctrine, there exists in the form of her bare breasts its antithesis, for her breasts at once key us into the figure's erotic charge as well as her capacity to nourish. In other words, they are an indication of the state of Peace's own bounty and the bounty that she can bestow on the realm. Now, bounty and the Habsburgs had been bound up for quite some time before van Aachen painted Peace art in abundance for Rudolph in 1612. I don't know why my slides are getting messed up. There we go. Take, for example, Albrecht Dürer's 1519 portrait of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Here, against a luscious green ground, Maximilian holds his personal device, a pomegranate, a section of which has been split to reveal its seedy center. In his youth, Maximilian recognized a metaphorical resemblance between himself and this ancient fruit of the Punica granatum. In fact, in regards to this resemblance, the emperor is rumored to have said, quote, "Though the pomegranate lacks a particularly handsome skin and a particularly lovely smell, its interior is full of noble munificence and shapely seeds," end quote. Whereas Maximilian seized on the symbol of the promise of bearing fruit, his grandson, Charles V, fixed with intensity on the motif unfurled and in full bloom. In Willem de Pannekker's tapestry series, executed between 1540 and 1555, the emperor's coat of arms hovers over a superior specimen of a field of flowers. Here in the tapestry's concatenations of spontaneous and unpredictable growth, we see plenitude unleashed and in its full ornamental mode. The tapestry's radical reduction of the imagery of copiousness to webs of flowers functions to connect the House of Habsburg to nature's pure and unchecked bounty. So, in a very simple sense, the van Aachen, the Dürer, and the de Pannemacher are linked together by being works of art commissioned by a Holy Roman Emperor. Yet they differ in that nature's explicit connection to the powers of the emperor in the von Aachen is integrated into a fully represented and ordered scene, instead of an addendum to a representation, symbolic or otherwise, of the ruler. And this regulation and cultivation of abundance was typically the case at Rudolph's court. Now, I realize here I want to point something out that I think I realized during today. This may be too subtle, so I want to just be really explicit about it. So I mean to think of these paintings as technological or involving techne in two ways. On one level, the way in which the paintings at Rudolph's court display or flaunt their artifice, okay? And in the second, in the way that we might be able to think of them as a system of images which are used for good governance. So I mean techne in these two ways, in the way that it's cultivated. So we'll get into that, but I think it's important for me to say that right now. Okay. So I started out by saying at Rudolph's court, right, instead of abundance being an addendum to a representation, it's integrated into a fully represented scene, mostly narratival. Perhaps an exception to this, to abundance's incorporation into a fully represented scene, is Arcimboldo's portrait of Rudolph in the guise of the Roman god of the seasons, Vertumnus. The Vertumnus painting is an example of the dissolution of the body of the emperor into the earth's plenitude, as if he himself is a cosmic force. For in its portrayal of the emperor's body as fertile and productive, Arcimboldo's painting negates any sign of the human body's natural limitations, incompleteness, and deficiencies, as well as the body's alternating phases of expenditure and recuperation. Instead, it presents the imperial body as if it were a superbody functioning at a continual level of intensity. Frequently, though, seasonal productivity occasioned Rudolphine art in the form of a goddess, as evidenced by this work by Bartholomeus Spranger of Bacchus and Ceres, Fleeing Venus of 1590, or Hans von Aachen's Bacchus, Ceres, and Amor, which was painted about a decade later. In these paintings, Ceres, an ancient Roman nature divinity often associated with peace and prosperity, catches the eye of Bacchus, whose triumphant entourage is out of sight and whose debauchery has been put on hold to enjoy the benefits of Ceres' embrace. Another earth goddess featured in Rudolph's Kunstkammer was the libidinous Maya, daughter of Atlas and Pleione, companion to the huntress Diana, and mother of the eloquent messenger Hermes. Just take a look at Spranger's Vulcan and Maya 1585. Here the foreplay between the god of the forge and the goddess of the earth, from whom he extracts his raw materials, is well underway. Indeed, her response to the gentle touch of his fingertips suggests that she is prepared to give him whatever he wants or needs. Vulcan's fingers upon Maya's breasts insinuates his genitals, concealed from view by Maya's splayed body. Spranger repeats the phallic form in the assemblage of fruit and vegetables that spill out of Maya's cornucopia. Observe the foreshortened eggplant, which extends forth from two small pieces of round fruit. Thus, Maya's horn of plenty is not merely an attribute that identifies her with nature, it makes a statement about nature. Here, nature embodied by Maya is a figure of extravagant sexualized fertility. A sexualized fertility that, on the one hand, seems to fly in the face of the Christian virtues most associated with self-control, namely continence, temperance, and chastity. On the other hand, she makes the purpose of coitus evident, and that instrumental purpose was to be fruitful and to multiply. It is surely no coincidence that Maya in ancient Greek was the word for midwife, right, to bring about this baby. Vulcan and Maya makes clear that basic to all procreation, in other words, basic to all generation and renewal, was sexual arousal. And Rudolph's collection was swamped with pictures that quite blatantly pictured sexual excitation. Carnal desire that desires excessively constitutes the deep structure of almost all the paintings of the loves of the gods, in which the pursued and the pursuer is found in one form or another. And perhaps this form of erotic longing at the court is nowhere better expressed than in the theme of the satyr's lascivious impulses. In a watercolor on vellum dated to 1604-1605, Daniel Froschel links 4 fleshy bodies to form a triangular shape on a fleshy surface. A satyr and a nymph, frequently identified as Jupiter and Antiope, occupy the center. Both figures strike energized poses, stretching and twisting their limbs and torsos in movements akin to rape, or rather akin to what courtly society imagined rape to be. The exact purpose of the second satyr on the right, or the pudo on the left, the exact purpose of the second satyr on the right, or the pudo on the left, is left open, though that the pudo keeps his eyes on the act while the striding satyr closes his suggests that what is occurring before us is not for all to see. Thus, even though the two figures go beyond narrative necessity, the satyr and the pudo form a visual and conceptual frame for this sexual encounter. Accompanying this play of gazes and bodies in the picture is the basket of fruit atop the satyr's head, which, as if from nowhere, is carried into the secluded, barren, craggy setting. This bountiful harvest is a symptom of natural fecundity, a fecundity that seems at once to emanate from the central satyr's erect phallus that he guides into the body of the nymph. Here, the penis of the satyr, who is a stand-in for Zeus, who is in turn a stand-in for Rudolph himself, becomes an inexhaustible and untamed source of corporeal plenitude, and is this divine superbody which disguises itself as a wild beast in order to appear. Once pursued, corporeal plenitude, or more specifically, corporeal excess, abounds in pictures made for Rudolph. Consider this exquisite drawing in the Albertina of Pan and Daphnis by yet another one of Rudolph's court artists, Joseph Heinz the Elder. Heinz's meticulous drawing is based on a Hellenistic sculptural group now in the Uffizi. Daphnis was a neatherd, Sicilian in origin. In some ancient accounts, he's the son of Hermes. In others, he's the messenger's favorite boy. The young shepherd was blinded after breaking a promise of fidelity to a nymph. An alien tells us, quote, "From this circumstance, pastoral songs came to be sung," end quote. Pan enters Daphnis's orbit in late antique renditions of the myth. In Glaucus, we learn that Daphnis dedicated his flute to the satyr, while Meleager claims that the god of the wild was Daphnis's lover. Clearly, the Uffizi sculpture is an amalgamation of these various myths. The blinded poet stares blankly, fondling his flute as Pan initiates an amorous embrace. Comparing the drawings of the wanton satyr and the famed inventor of pastoral poetry to the sculpture which inspired it reveals much about what was likely valued in the drawing. Heinz supplemented the sculpture not only with color, which enlivened the statue, but also through filling in lost appendages, such as Daphnis's right hand and Pan's penis. He also felt the need to turn and smooth out Daphnis's head and neck, which is clearly a restoration from a different sculpture and clearly the head of a female. It's conceivable that Heinz imagined that it was the light touch of the blind Daphnis's hand which engorged the satyr's penis. Daphnis's more diminutive and flaccid member, a set piece in contrasting anatomical specificity, highlights the satyr's uncontrollable id. It is as if Heinz was aware that Daphnis was often associated with the young, passive, and noble bodies of the Eraminos in ancient Greece. Perhaps the most tenuous yet freighted difference between the sculpture and Heinz's drawing is Daphnis's feminine body. Nowhere are the powers of Heinz's imagination more evident than in his rendering of Daphnis's fleshy belly, narrow shoulders, and full hips. These subtle alterations, or maybe amplifications is a more apt word here, of the sculpture, elicit both Pan's desire and the viewer's surprised attention. Thus, in the drawing, it is Daphnis's supplemented and excessive body, both male and female, that lends him his inner and extra pictorial potency. At first glance, Bartolomeus Dolendo's Mannerist print of Hercules in Omphale seems worlds apart from Heinz's Al Antica drawing. If Daphnis's double body signaled his potency, Hercules' androgyny keys us into his degradation. And just as Spranger's painting of Maya and Vulcan reminded us that sexual desire was part of the same spirit that filled the fields with crops, this print makes clear that sexual desire can lead to temptation, weakness, and even helplessness. For in this print, we catch Hercules in the midst of women's work, spinning, a punishment for having thrown the prince of Oechalia over a wall, killing him. So for his murder, Hercules is forced to marry Omphale, a Lydian queen, and he was forced to become her slave. Liberated from her feminine toils, Omphale dresses up in the skin of the Nemean lion and wields Hercules' olive wood club. In the print, the suspension of the male-female hierarchy is made apparent not just by way of Hercules' extravagant gown and foppish headdress, but also in the way his body is cast into a new mold. No longer occupying the classic and conventional heroic male body, Hercules appears gaunt with a trim waist, budding breasts, and erect nipples. Could this be the hero who, according to Virgil, subdued the bull and Kilios to remove his horn and give it to the nymph Abundance? With the male and female body united into one, Hercules' excess violates not just social, but natural norms. Dolendo's print is based on Spranger's various rendition of the subject, one instance which I show you here. Indeed, the print is just one of several engravings of Hercules and Omphale that were generated from paintings made at and for Rudolph's court. And I can show you more of these at the end if you want. Prints which circulated widely, disseminating what we now refer to as Rudolphine mannerism. This production of images of bodies of biological and sexual excess is just another instance of the cultivatable nature of Rudolph's collection. For as Rebecca Zorek and Terence Cave have pointed out, the 16th century word copie meant both abundance and physical copy. And there's much more to be said about the ways in which the blossoming of print production at Rudolph's court partakes in the various themes of copiousness that I have been trying to lay out for you here, but I'd like to return, and very briefly for a moment, to Hercules and the magnification or multiplications of his body, particularly his budding breasts. So here, just to remind you of Hercules' budding breasts. Whereas Hercules' breasts feed his image of humiliation, the breasts of Bartolomeus Spranger's polymested Kibble manifest the splendor of the divine body. In this drawing, dated between 1585 and 1590, now housed in the Albertina, we have an instance in which abundance is articulated by way of a multiplication of values. And could there be anything more suitable for the figure who is recognized to be the mother of the gods, the begetter and nourisher of all? Here she stands, casually, adorned with her mural crown and arm cuffs, her hand jauntily on her hip, her engorged breasts prepared to ceaselessly suckle multiple beings at once. The Magna Mater makes appearances in other works produced at Rudolph's court. For the sake of time, I'll just show you one more. Here in Spranger's drawing of Kybele and Minerva, the capacity of Kybele's body is not conveyed through magnification or multiplication, but by the performance of lactation. Observe the streams of milk that squirt from her breasts, as if the demonstration of her body's vitality for Minerva, as if a demonstration of her body's vitality for Minerva, who strides behind her in full armor. These figures of Kybele we have just briefly looked at are exemplary of the figure of the mother at Rudolph's court. The mother does not appear as a vessel, nor as a figure sacrificial in her generation, neither a figure who is loving or tender. Instead, she provides the endless resource of herself. By suckling at her breasts, all things flourish. She is the origin of the world's ceaseless process of becoming. So the rhetoric of the images examined here today and many others at Rudolph's court encourage a thinking about the generative properties of the world not as technological, that is, not as a product of human craft and artifice, but instead as expressive of a natural self-producing entity. What's more, and perhaps more importantly, This pictorial rhetoric of what I might call the anti-Techne is crucial to how we think about what this system of images can tell us about the technology and the cultivation of good governance. To be sure, to consider these paintings and drawings and prints to be a techne of good governance is to shift our basic understanding of the role of abundance within a political domain. For instance, one might think abundance points to a fear or discontent with finitude, or it might indicate the desire to be generative, and generative in the sense of not just having more, but to be more. And one could also deem that imagery of abundance, like that we've seen today, is an attempt to communicate a guarantee of security, or one might view it as a flourishing of the present that replaced a time that was barren and dark. At their core, all of these views on figurations of abundance see it as a product of a will to power on the part of the patron or on the part of the nation. But is it conceivable, and this is my question to you, is it conceivable that the works we have seen here today are evidence of a system of images that attempt to convey the transcendence of a restless desire for power? In other words, might they be a technology to overtly signal that Rudolph lacked political ambition? For as Aristotle reminds us, catastrophic political moves come from an excess of ambition and not a deficit. And what could be more prudent than to be unmoved by political eros and content with all abundance has to offer? For one who is moved by political eros may not deliberate properly and may act on things which are not, to use Aristotle's phrase, for the universal good. To be content is to thwart corruption, and corruption, the philosopher tells us, quote, distorts and causes one to be mistaken about the principles bound up in action, end quote. So to conclude, if we look at these excessive images of excess from this rather oblique angle I'm suggesting here, they appear to be less a pictorial manifestation of uncontrollable urges and more of a technology of good governance crafted by a person who, according to Aristotle, is in control of his political appetites. And after all, the promise of abundance is that you never have to ask to what end. Thank you.
For a few questions. Vera?
Thank you. I really enjoyed that as usual. You do have some pushbacks because since you welcome them.
Yeah, go for it. I hope I can
Three really fast.
Yeah.
One is, I think, as you can expect, I would urge, look at reason of state rather than Aristotle, because eros, ambition, great thing in reason of state. It's a driver. It's something to be utilized. It's not something that you need to necessarily check in that way. And so that might reframe your conclusion once you look at that. Speaking of which, in terms of thinking about in systems, as we've been talking about, prudence is about anti-systematic contingency. So I wonder how thinking about prudence in relationship to this body of art could urge us to think about iconography in a different way. That is to say, if you have a group of images that are supposed to offer political messages or counsel in some way, if your concept of politics is constantly changing contingent, it can never have a stable interpretation. So their artificiality is to make them in such a way that they can be constantly reinterpreted depending on changing circumstances. And so there won't be a system of interpretation. And I'm convinced that's why some of those images like Holtzius's Allegory of Alchemy defies any systematic interpretation precisely, for that reason. And finally, about the anti-Techne of some of these images. I think if you think about them in alchemical terms, which kind of overrides the distinction between art and nature, it doesn't have to be anti-Techne. Because if you have a vitalist conception of the world in which humankind can be part of that process, humans can be involved in these processes of procreation and enhance them and make them even greater without there being any kind of Techne, anti-Techne.
Right, so it's resolved.
It's resolved.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, Alessandra, then Tina.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Jessica. I like the project. I think there is really something new. I liked in particular how your conclusions about this kind of cathartic power of bringing the governor to a kind of stoic relationship. No? The only thing that for me was a little bit more difficult to understand is what you call abundance. I mean, the kind of very, very large meaning that you give to abundance. And in particular, I don't understand very well how fertility has these images. I understand well how they could play, kind of cathartic, but I don't understand very well the part on fertility. Could you explain more how fertility and excess, all these images of excess and natural excess and then fertility? Could you explain a little bit more how they are about
where I am on that?
Yeah.
So I think that there is this there is a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? There's a way in which sexual fertility can be, or sexual desire, or eros, let's say, can be part, or is viewed as part as the same kind of impulse, right, that causes the world to kind of create the things that it does, right? That the sexual desire within the human is the same thing out of which the earth is generative, right? And we can see that in ancient and medieval thinkers as well, right? So there's the sense. So how do you picture, right, sexual impulses and sexual carnality? So I show you the Froschel for that example, but we could look at others at Rudolph's court as a way of talking about this human impulse to be generative, like nature's impulse to be generative, to create. And so by abundance, what I really mean is, particularly what I mean is generation, generativity, things which are created by the earth. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Tina, and then Pam, and Wolfram, and then I think we're out of time. And if I could ask the questions be kept succinct.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed also your talk. And as we talked before, I once studied the images of Fortuna in the context of nature and mining, and I also wonder what role, if you have also seen them in your studies of the pictorial program, and there comes also the aspect of abundance, nature, and incertitude, and governments. So where does this? It's a really nice and stable system that you presented here, but when it comes to be shaky and unstable ground and all this semantic range of scarcity and but also someone has to deal with that.
Absolutely. I have not, in the very early stages of this, come across or been caught by images of Fortuna with regards to abundance. And the question of scarcity is an interesting one. And how does that get articulated at court? Well, there's a way in which you can kind of think about, right, one way in which if you view the abundance, which is figured by, let's say, a cornucopia, right? And the cornucopia always has the potential to empty itself out, right? So we can see that this notion of scarcity is kind of already perhaps built into this imagery of abundance itself. But as of right now, that's my answer for you. I need to think about these questions, especially after talking with you today, to think about these questions of scarcity. Right now, I've just been looking for, images of abundance and trying to figure out what's going on with them.
Good. Pam, and then Wolfram, and then
I just wanted to underscore Vera's point about alchemy, the discourse of alchemy, and mining is humans are part of creating the abundance by Techne in things like mining and smelting and so on. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and this is my real question, is the polysemic nature of these images. I mean, they are about abundant interpretations.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, I don't know whether that's about trying to portray contingency or whether it's how you would think about it. Yeah.
In the end, I want this book to kind of be about, right, the way in which the Kunstkammer creates like an interpretive apparatus for the viewer, right, and that built into these images of abundance, like this hermeneutic and exegetical abundance, which is constantly generative within the images of themselves, right? So that's how I've been kind of thinking about how this project will eventually end.
Okay, and Wolfram, and that will be our last question.
Where does, in these images, comes the ancient Roman saying, "Sine ceres et Bacchus frigit Venus"?
Well, where does the actual text come in?
What the role is, you didn't mention it at all, but at least 1/3 of the depictions contain that.
Absolutely. And there's the famous Holzius image too of this at Rudolph's court itself. I have to think more about this, right? There's Tom's reading of the image. Think about Venus as being full of society and what happens to society when these things flee, and I'm convinced by that. So that's where I'll leave it right now. How it plays into this, I'll still work it out. Right now, I'm interested in the series figure as an image of seasonal fertility that is sexualized in this way.
Okay, well, thank you very much.